Okay. Okay. We're good?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Welcome to the speaker night, everyone. Today is October 22nd, if you didn't know the date. And thank you all so much for coming. So we have a brief little sign-up form that you can scan here. I'll have that up for like a couple more seconds. Yeah. Okay. And then, so we are EGaDS. In case you don't know who we are the Electronic Game Developers Society. So we are the main game dev org on campus, and we are interdisciplinary and foster a sense of community and educate our members on different skills within game dev, allow our give opportunities for our members to be creative, and connect our members with professional opportunities. So here's a list of who runs EGaDS. We've already sort of gone over this previously, but in case you didn't know, this is one of our speaker nights. So we usually have it every 3 weeks, but it depends. Last speaker night we had was part of Texas Game Jam, that sort of thing. And here have previous past speakers have been affiliated with these companies. And then we'll have a feedback form. It will also be available at the end. So if you want to tell us how we did, then feel free to via this QR code. And here are some upcoming events. So we will be working with the RTF department on RTF Gaming Symposium. And this will be a celebration and inquiry into video games and esports. I believe EGaDS members can showcase their games there. And pizza, snacks, and beverages will be provided, and there will be speakers, an arcade, and a lot of other fun stuff. So scan this QR code if you want more info. We'll be having a Halloween social next Monday, 6 to 8 p.m. and 202. So come and celebrate Halloween with us. It should be a lot of fun. We'll have Unity and art workshops coming up next week and the week after. And those will just be an opportunity to press on your Unity and art skills. We'll be doing 2D art as we've been doing through this semester. And then Dev Nights every Thursday, 6 to 8 p.m. on Discord and occasionally in person. We host Dev Nights, which are just chill events that you can work on games, talk to other EGaDSians, or just study and work. And we occasionally have alumni and industry visits pop up as those people are available. And then here are some opportunities. So we have a internship opportunity with from Texas Immersive Institute with Disney, and there will be some people coming from the Disney College program in the Immersive Institute at October 24th from 5 to 7 p.m. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to, I believe there are more details in the jobs, internships, and events page. And then you can stay connected with us through our Discord in case you haven't, or any of these other socials. And then you can always join EGaDS, and you'll get exclusive access to the GDAD Career Fair, and also a exclusive t-shirt like the one our speaker is wearing, and like our president is wearing, and like I forgot to wear, and lifetime access to the EGaDS LinkedIn group. Special thanks to our sponsors, Zynga and Skeleton Key. And now for our speaker, we have Professor Dr. Abraham. She is an assistant professor of instruction at the CS department here. Her research is geared towards video game development and artistic tools. And I actually do research with her, so yeah. Let me pull up your slides real quickly, if I can remember how to use
Yeah,
PowerPoint.
you figured it out before I did.
Okay, woo. Feel free to take it away.
All right.
And,
All right.
yeah.
Well, thank you for having me. I think I know many of you. I was not sure sort of the distribution of CS to design versus art interests. Actually, can I? Who's like CS focused? Okay, most of you art focused. Okay, D- AT design focused. Okay, so kind of mostly CS. Okay, mine is actually going to be fairly non-technical, because I was asked to talk about sort of like my game design journey, which is actually not what I get paid for. That is like entirely a thing that I do in my own time. I'm going to address this just a little. Sorry, Bobby.
No worries.
So I guess it's gonna be kind of a talk that spans like how I got here, because I think that's kind of important. Sort of the philosophies and the journey. There's going to be actually quite a bit of failure in it, because I think that'll be an interesting study. You don't see, we'll talk about hobbyist development versus indie or production development, because I'm allowed to fail because no one's paying me to do it. And then we'll talk about like why I decided to sort of readjust what I was doing. But if at any point you have a question or comment, please do feel free to speak up. So let's actually start with my journey to game design. Journey will come up a lot through this because this was very influential to me. Who's played this game? Oh my God. Okay. Actually, we should just stop here. Everyone go home, play Journey. If you all play at the same time, you'll even be networked to each other. I'll talk about the networked experience. But this actually this like definitely was a huge influence on like why I was like, okay, I really want to do cooperative games. So we will come back to that. I will explain how the game works though. But my journey in some sense really began not like in any way of wanting to go into the games industry. I just played games since childhood. I've always liked them. I ended up through a series of events in college. I thought I was going to go into marine biology, and my name is the Shark. I still love the Shark in my CS alias. But through a series of events, I sort of ended up not enjoying biology. Randomly, sort of got into a CS class through a friend just saying this was a fun class, and sort of on that path was like, wow, games are some of the things you can make when you have programming skills. That's kind of cool. Definitely the best thing to do with your programming skills. And so I sort of ended up moving into game space, primarily early mobile space. And I was a tools programmer, which basically, well, I'll explain what that means in just a moment. But as you'll see, it does not have necessarily much to do directly with game design. In this process, also got a PhD in computer graphics because I developed quite an interest in graphics over time. My area was non-photorealistic rendering and artist tools. And again, I think this comes because I have a lot of love for sort of this art and games, and it's very interesting to me. Finally, also during this time, just over the years, sort of started doing independent game development, a lot in mobile space. We'll talk about what early mobile space looks like. It looks like nothing like what y'all are used to in mobile space now. And some sort of just more independent platform releases, I should say PC releases as well. Okay, so first of all, what is tools programming? Who's actually familiar with that concept? Okay, Bobby, a little bit. Yeah, so essentially tools programmers create systems and functionality for other developers to use. So generally they are either third-party contracted or in-house. And like you work on all sorts of things. Like tools programmers just kind of work on like you're just basically like we need to have a thing, and then you go and make the thing. So like I don't remember anything about the Bluetooth protocol, but at some point in my life I made a middleware interface for it. I've done a peer-to-peer networking library. Most of my stuff is just like graphics support and libraries for artists. So essentially you have OpenGL here, OpenGLES, whatever. Vulkan didn't even exist at this time, and then you basically layer stuff on top of it to make it more accessible. Things that you might be like, that seems like a thing they include now, gesture and touch recognition libraries. They used to not have those, right? So I'm talking about some of this is very early in mobile space. So like essentially a lot of this stuff is actually stuff that is now just out of a box, but at the time you had to have someone actually make it for you. And then a lot of stuff like, I don't know, you just end up making parsers, plugins, standalone applications, stuff that lets people integrate stuff into games. It's very much a library focused job. And if you sort of look at this at a glance, you'd be like, well, okay, you don't really talk to customers much, right? Like you're just writing code all day and integrating frameworks and stuff. But I actually disagree with that. I actually think tools is very, very customer focused, because your customer is essentially other developers. And I think you work very closely with trying to make things that are useful to developers, and even though they're not the game player, the choices you make for building out a tool will make their lives easier or harder, depending on how you make it, which will affect the gameplay. So first of all, who's heard the phrase, the customer is always right? This is the actual full phrase. The customer is always right in matters of taste. So that doesn't mean the customer's opinion of like what you should be doing is correct, but it does mean that they are allowed to want what they want. And I just want to include that because I think it's very important to understand that taste will vary. And especially when we get into game design, what people want out of games will vary, and you're kind of gonna have to respect that. In terms of tools, tools are about making useful things. So that is different from a game. Games are meant to be fun. Tools need to facilitate development. So most of the consideration you have is like, what do you need the tool for, and what do you want to accomplish using the tool? So it's not going to be like, I want to make a cool looking interface. You're not going to be like making things look really nice, but you do need to think about like, what buttons do we need to design for? Bobby, you actually are experiencing this. You're like, we need some sliders, right? So it's like, so eventually you just are like, we need some functionality that people can use. So interface design actually does come up a lot. And again, this does relate to how games are designed, because you're thinking about this is what the use case is. And I do believe it does relate to the success of the game. And actually, I would argue the modern era with like all the stuff you get for free and like just out of Unreal really makes it much easier to develop games than it used to be. And I do think making tools has similar to design principles to making a game. The player in this case is other developers. This is more my side of design. Functionality and usability tend to guide decisions. That's not like you don't have to do that, but I'll come back to my design principles later. But if you want to be avant-garde, this is not the space to be avant-garde. You're not here to make interesting things, you're here to make functional things. So let's sort of like, okay, so I'm making these things. I'm interested in interfaces. It's very interesting to sort of see how user experience looks in a tool sense. Essentially, I still like making tools. I still like the act of doing it. But the reason I sort of got less interested in doing it in a like long-term professional sense is one thing is honestly, mobile space just went to crap. I don't know if what I'm allowed to say here, but I'll just say crap. Game space design in mobile essentially was solved as of 2010. And what does solved mean? It means we have figured out the way to maximize money extraction from players. So a lot of the pre-2010 mobile space was actually very creative and interesting. People were like really experimenting with what does it mean to have a game like shaped like this, you know, sort of that design versus this. What does it mean to have geolocation? What does it mean to have touch controls? Like, what do these games look like? And the answer is they look like time-gated loot boxes. It's sort of what we all decided. I realize Zang is one of your sponsors, so maybe I shouldn't be saying this. Hopefully they're not watching this. Essentially, that's the rise of gacha that was sort of introduced as a mechanic in 2010. Free-to-play became the mechanics over fun. And I just wasn't like interested in working in this space. And I find a lot of the tools you build around making these kinds of things very uninteresting. The other thing was I was kind of looking at like, wow, all these game engines, like, I know this sounds maybe weird because we've decided a decade ago is a really long time ago, but believe it or not, there used to be a time when like you wouldn't use an off-the-shelf game engine. You essentially had to build your own or pay quite a bit of money to use it. Does anyone know that Unity was originally Mac only? Yeah. That was so like, it was a game engine, but like it was sort of a hobbyist game engine. As of Unity 3.0, I would say that was when it essentially introduced DirectX support, so it was like now a viable game engine. That was 2010. Godot and Unreal would be released in 2014, slightly later. And essentially I was looking at that, I'm like, okay, so basically now all the things that I was sort of custom building for different clients were sort of things that you could get off the shelf. And that was great. That was interesting. But I was also like, on some level, I kind of got into game programming because I liked programming. And I definitely like that programming is a much more stable career path than art or design. Sorry, artists and designers. But on some level, I kind of wanted to be an artist and designer, right? Like you sort of are like, wouldn't it be cool to do your game idea? Everyone thinks that at least once in their life, and that's a good thing. And so yeah, I was like, well, okay, so now we have all these off-the-shelf game engines. Suddenly, I can nominally not spend my time making tools to make development. I can actually start making games, which of course well, at the end, I'll be like, yeah, I still just go back and I'm like, I'm gonna make this tool for it instead of actually working on it, because it is fun. But it was basically, I was like, okay, what kind of games do I want to make? And it turns out, philosophically, the games I like to make are sort of actually similar to the way I view making tools. So I generally enjoy straightforward, enjoyable ergonomic controls. So, and that sounds like you're like, that's obvious. Like, that's not obvious. Like, who's ever played like Getting Over It, or like, let's just be honest. Sorry, From games. Like, From Soft controls, are those good controls? No, they're not. They're still fun games. Like, I think makes really good games, but I don't enjoy like their control schemes. So I just like really easy to pick up, simple ways to think about it. Also, this is a good. I'm not calling out From Soft at all here. I like linear or logarithmic curves in difficulty. So like, i.e., you play the game, and at any given point, you're like, the challenge is about the same. Like, as you get better, the challenge goes up, but it's at the sort of same-ish rate. This is very different, of course, than like a FromSoft game, which is like high challenge at the beginning and then lower challenge later. And I have many friends who do really interesting indie projects that are like very quirky and very original, and that's honestly not for me. I feel like my interest is sort of niche. It's not like super mainstream, but it's still kind of mainstream. Like, it would be things that are like, you could potentially have customers who are not like, I am of this one small audience and I just really love this one thing. So yeah, here are some of the games that sort of interest me in terms of how they're made. I don't know how many of these you'll actually recognize. Journey is the one up there. We'll come back to that. Ico will come up a lot. You probably have heard of Shadow of Colossus more famously. Ico, Shadow of Colossus, Last Guardian are essentially a trilogy. I love Mega Man X, so I love platformer games. That's Phoenix Wright. That's like just a really good game. I'm replaying all of it right now. Little Big Planet, one of my all-time favorite platformers, physics-based puzzle platformer. And then in the middle is a Tales game, and that's because I do like. This is going to have to come back to the co-op action RPG. So like, I'm actually going to say I don't want to make RPGs, so I'm not interested in the stats, but I do like the action RPG. And there are plenty of games I love, but I don't necessarily want to make. So like, again, Final Fantasy 15, one of my favorite games. I don't want to make an RPG. They're like too complex. I'm not a systems programmer. I love fighting games. I don't want to make a fighting game. I love Metal Gear Solid. Don't want to make a stealth game. Devil May Cry is great. I don't actually want to make games like that complex. So again, I love many things, but I think it's good to sort of know, like, what do you want to do? And again, going back here, if we look at these, most of these games actually have some cooperative aspect. Journey is not a co-op game in the classic sense. Little Big Planet you can definitely play with friends. Tales you can play with friends. Ico is not cooperative except in Japan, but it has this like strong cooperative aspect. And actually, like, I feel like there's like a lot of feelings of these are like friendshipy games, right? It's all about the friendship. So that was kind of where I was like, so I'd been making games of varying sorts in that kind of space, little puzzlers, small platformers. And I sort of was like, okay, I wanna do something interesting and novel and a little bit more original. And I sort of settled on, I think cooperative space is very rife for development. I would say it's an underserved market, in fact. I think we see a little bit more of co-op these days, but it's always that year. There's like one or two games, like people will be like one of y'all could be like, what about It Takes Two? One of you might say. And I'd be like, yes, what other big cooperative games are out right now? And the answer is like maybe a handful, right? It's always kind of niche, but everyone loves co-op. That's because playing with friends is fun. And I'm not huge into competitive space. The only real competitive games I play are fighting games. But I will say and we could have like, if we want to have a whole conversation about what I think is wrong with the MOBA genre at the end, like I am happy to go into that. But that's like a whole talk right there. And actually, this was a really good one because Deadlock is out now. Players should be able to play games with friends of different skill levels. That is like an ethos and a belief of mine, which I don't think competitive space games are good at serving. So, y'all know what I'm talking about? Do y'all believe me? Yeah. Okay. Like I feel like this is not a controversial thing, but I think like if you haven't felt that when you've played a game, and you're like being steamrolled because the MMR disparity is so large that like it's like it actually isn't fun. And I think co-op games tend to allow you to play with somebody who maybe is less skilled or more skilled, and you can both get the same thing out of it. And I wish there was more of that. Couch co-op used to be a very common feature in older games. Actually, a bunch of even Super Nintendo games would be single player games, but you could like let the second player be just like a character would follow along behind them, or like in battle mode. Like even in Final Fantasy VI, I don't know if they all played that one. It actually was, you could play it with a friend. You could have the other characters, one of the characters or two of the characters, I forget, would like be controllable by another player. So you don't like walk around the world together, but you can actually play together. And I feel like that was kind of an expectation because back in the day, it sort of assumed you played with your like siblings or people came over from the neighborhood. But it is fairly niche. But I do think having co-op is a huge value add. Now, co-op is hard to add, so I think the next part will just be like, what did I decide to do for co-op? What worked? What didn't work? And I think we could have a whole conversation because there's a much bigger world than what I'm doing. I'm just focusing on the specific case I wanted to do, which is I wanted to do something that sort of focused on Russian Siberian folklore. I have an interest in that part of the world, and I think it's neat, and I don't see a lot of games set in there, and I just was like, okay, let's do that. That sounds fun to me. I like narrative-focused games. You maybe could tell from my list. So high-level plot is that there's two characters, because you're co-op. Katya is an orphan girl, has a Frieza wolf, Volk, which is Russian for wolf, nothing creative there. And they're basically just on a journey, right? So they're just essentially searching. And if you know a little bit about folklore, you'll know that that is a house on chicken legs at the end. So presumably at some point you have to fight Baba Yaga, which is a big sort of boogeyman figure in Russian folklore. But I'm not going to talk too much about the narrative. Let's focus on like, okay, so I want to make a game. I came up with a high-level concept. What does this game look like? And so essentially, it was going to be a 2.5D style game, puzzle platformer for reasons I'll talk about. I wanted it to be fully cooperative, which is actually a bit of that is a sort of contentious thing to do, right? Like the problem with making a game fully cooperative is quite literally you can't play without another person nearby. And we'll come back to that. There's a couple fully cooperative games. It Takes Two is one of them. And essentially you have to make choices about how you build out your design to make that work. The other thing I wanted to do was asymmetric gameplay. I'll come back to what that means in a moment. And I wanted local and networked play. That is because the networked play was essential. I definitely wanted local play. That was without question. Network play is essentially to make a game more, like if I wanted to pitch this to a publisher, you're going to have a harder time pitching a non-networked cooperative game. That's like going to be a hard stop. So I was like, okay, let's think of it from the ground up from a network perspective. And then I always like environmentally driven storytelling. That's like Team Ico games, right? Like you walk around. I'll say Shadow of Colossus. I think that's probably the most played game, and like there's a whole rich world even with very minimal dialogue. So I was like, okay, I'll focus on the gameplay aspects, not have less narrative aspects because I am a single person developer, and so I didn't want to do everything. 2.5D essentially means I am going to use 3D assets, but I'm going to control physics in a 2D way. 3D assets are actually easier to build out and make than 2D sprites, because 2D sprites are an incredible amount of work on the artist's part. And also 2D puzzle platforming is much easier to design than 3D. So like if you're tuning jumps and physics in 2D, actually we have some people who are taking the paradigms class right now. You probably have noticed if you constrain physics to a plane rather than 3D, life becomes a lot easier. So you can like essentially constrain physics and you're not gonna have weird physics bugs glitching out. So that was like one of the sort of first things I was working with. I wanted like the feel of a 3D world, so I essentially put in a spline system so that characters could move along the space in 3D, but the physics was always 2D and all the interactions were 2D. And then also there was an idea of a foreground and a background. That just opened up a lot of different puzzle design. So that was like a pretty, normal, natural decision. Puzzle platformer genre. This is actually a kind of, this is one I sort of like was thinking about quite a bit. Puzzle platformer, you might notice there's a lot of indie games that are puzzle platformer. That's because it is one of the most accessible genres to indie solo devs. It turns out you have a very simple player package. You make some puzzles, you make some platforms, you got a game. So there's like, it's like a lot easier than I'm going to build out a full tech tree full of, skills, and then I need to balance them, and then I need to put in like different levels that use my different skills and all that kind of stuff. I think the other thing is there's a lot of great examples of co-op puzzle mechanics in existing games. I'll list a few of them as we go. So it's like you can just be like, okay, I need some inspiration, just go play some games and see kind of what they're doing. The cons is very heavily saturated genre. So like making a puzzle platformer stand out is kind of a challenge. This was, I'm not necessarily, this is weird because I'm like talking to my students. I'm not going to quit my job if I'm suddenly a successful indie developer. Like I do actually really love teaching. So I don't like, it's not like I want to be like, I'm not like, oh, I'm waiting for my big break to leave. So like money isn't the primary goal. But like, it's nice to make some money, right? Like nobody's going to complain if you have a successful product. So I do try to consider market considerations a little bit, even if it's not like my primary concern. And also, as I was kind of developing levels, and this will come back later, I think making a really good puzzle platformer that can last a while is kind of hard. If you've ever tried to, you always come up with like, you're like, I have 10 great puzzles. Well, now you need 100 more of those, right? So it's like, it is having a really simple mechanic. I think there's an elegance when you can make that work, but I think it's very challenging. And because it's fully cooperative, every mechanic needed to rely on two people to complete, which in some ways makes the reuse of mechanics sort of a little bit harder. So we'll come to that next. Fully cooperative game. There's essentially a couple things we can do here. First of all, in the puzzle genre, these are puzzle genres I'm going to focus on. I'll talk about some other genres in a bit. Many puzzle games have non-requisite co-op, so they'll essentially have a co-op mode, and then they'll have non-co-op mode. One of the classics is swap between characters in a single player mode. So that's like Trine, if anyone's played that series. You have one of 3 characters and you could swap between them. If you play with a friend, they can be on the screen at the same time. Little Big Planet and Portal 2 have limited cooperative challenges. Now, Portal 2 has a whole 2-player campaign mode, right? But it is a separate mode from the main story mode. So you play, they essentially built a whole thing for that versus the whole game. Little Big Planet, for anyone who has ever not played that, you go through the level, and then periodically you'll get to like a puzzle room where it's like kind of like a little room, and then it says you need this many people to solve it, and then you can go ahead and solve it. So that's a little bit different. And then finally, another one that's very popular is AI Companion in single player mode. So if you've played Never Alone, Resident Evil 5 or 6, they're puzzle games. I don't know if I should have put them here. I think they're puzzle games. Yeah, I'm going to count them. And then Ico. Those are all essentially I would say they're more focused on the AI companion than not. Note that Ico only has co-op in the Japanese release, so basically you would beat in Japan. If you beat the game, you could play with a friend as Yorda. That's not true in American release. I wanted to do requisite co-op, and this is still something I want to do. This has been a back and forth, but I think I'm going to stand firm on it, which is that co-op is almost always secondary to the main gameplay features and non-requisite co-op, and I think it gets sidelined a lot for that. And I think there is a need and a place for, no, you just have to have a friend. This is, in fact, I talk about this a lot. My husband does like art and development as well, so I'll be like, maybe we should think about just going to allowing it. He's like, no, people need friends, and so I'm like, yeah, that's fair. Also, I just feel like Skazka is meant to be a story about friendship relying on others. So it's like I feel like that's actually a part of the central theme. So in that sense, I think it directly relates. From a practical perspective, if anyone has ever tried to make AI in a game, complex AI in a game, you are well aware that it's really hard to get right. And especially with companion AI, people get really annoyed about it in a way that they are much more forgiving of like enemy AI. Right. So like if you have companion AI that people find annoying, it like breaks this whole idea of friendship because suddenly they like hate the companion AI. Yeah, and I think it's really you're thinking of some games. Yeah, people like I actually really like Ashley in Resident Evil 4, but I know many people like always complain about her, and I'm like, like she's fine. Like she's just the president's daughter. What does she know? She's got viruses or parasites or whatever the plot of 4 is. What's that? Oh my God. Now I actually, yes, I hate Donald and Goofy. They're useless. I'm glad you died. Like you deserved this. You chose this, Donald. Yeah, no, so that's actually a great example of companion AI where you're like, I hate you. The message has not been received about the power of friendship. Yeah, also just it's hard for a small studio when I'm basically handling all programming considerations. It's very hard to get both AI and networking right. So you're going to kind of want to pick one to focus on. I have a fair bit of network experience, so I was like, I can do this, like, at least at a low level. Eventually, like, if I was going to do it to scale, I'd eventually need to secure funding from a publisher, bring in some extra engineers. But, like, getting the prototype set up, I'm like, I can do networking. Yeah, I'm like, I don't know. That sounds really hard, especially early, pre-Unreal. Unreal makes it a lot easier. We'll come back to that later. All right. Let's keep going. Asymmetric gameplay. So this is basically where you have two characters with a completely different skill set, i.e. one character can do some things, the other character can do other things. So I basically had the idea that the girl would be focused on puzzle solving, essentially environmental manipulation, whereas Volk would have a bunch of movement tools and some of it. Like grappling hook is a movement tool, dig is a environmental manipulation tool. But essentially it was like, that's sort of my domain. And I mostly had a small, simple, static player package. I did not want to have a lot of skill acquirements over time. I'm actually going to change my opinion on that now, and we'll come back to that later. But at the time I was like, okay, it's really hard to develop mechanics, so I'm just going to keep it as simple as possible. The feature, of course, this is all like typical, right? Like that's just platforming stuff. The more interesting stuff was the cooperative team ups. So essentially there was a button when you were doing an action, and it's context sensitive. So it was actually kind of a hard thing to implement, because it's essentially like you press a button and then depending on the context, different things happen. You have cooperative team ups. So one of the big ones was an assist team up. So essentially Katya could grab ledges but couldn't pull herself up, but she could reach heights that were not otherwise feasible to like trigger things and actions. And similarly, if you're gonna have a wolf in a game, I think it's like required by law that you should be able to ride a wolf in a game. And I think any game that has a wolf and you don't get to ride the wolf is functionally wrong. So if there's gonna be mounted team ups, which is essentially smash plus run. So those were like very heavy platforming segments. And then some like sort of puzzly mechanics, like essentially I like to call them the block pushing puzzles, like, launching things It's like the sort of typical stuff you do in a puzzle environmental manipulation game. And then finally, essentially there were actually Kingdom Hearts is not a terrible, like, it's fairly simple combat, so it was not meant to be complex. But that basically means in the big combo, you just press if you both press X, you get, or in this case triangle, you get a big cool flashy attack which can essentially target enemy weak points at specified times. These enemies are puzzle bosses, not action bosses. If that makes sense to you. So like Devil May Cry are action bosses. There's like a puzzle component, but you target the thing and then you hit the thing with a big combo. Puzzle bosses are like more like Mario bosses, where you do some series of actions and you get it right, and then that moves on to the next phase. But because of this, both players are required to compete the levels in boss fights, and we'll come back to kind of the length of the level. I think I talk about that later. In terms of actual play considerations, all this design means in terms of local play, you have to think about like, what does that actually mean? And essentially, if you have two characters, you have to decide on split screen versus one screen. So shared screen, split screen. That's like one of the first things you have to decide on. Split screen, It Takes Two, and Borderlands. Borderlands I know isn't a puzzle game, but I think this is fine. Shared screen, Diablo, Little Big Planet, Never Alone, for anyone who's played any of these games. This is like, split screen just reduces the view of the world, but it's easy to implement. So like I probably should have done that, but I actually like shared screen because it means you have to handle varying distance between players. You essentially have to figure out, do I always have this much room between players, or do I have a way to have a more dynamic player camera, which is what I wanted to do. But I liked this seamless view of the world. I'm just not a big split screen person. Nowadays, TVs are so big, it probably doesn't matter. But back in the day, TVs were kind of small, so when you had split screen real estate, it always felt kind of cramped. And I just I wanted more of like the idea of a big expansive world, even if it was a puzzle platformer world rather than an open world. It was kind of meant to give like as you can imagine, there's big long running segments. So like I wanted the idea of it feeling like a very expansive world. And I just think shared screen feels nice. Okay, this is just like a tiniest bit of technical details for those of you who are interested in implementing cameras. Essentially, because I was in a 2D world, I could do an orthographic camera, which actually makes things a lot easier. I can calculate the center of the camera based on the player position, so I essentially do like a center of mass between them, and that's like the center. And then you don't want your camera, and I don't know who's actually made a camera here before. Anybody? Yeah, so like if you've made cameras, you know that there's like a bunch of like camera sins you don't want to do, which like make it really jerky and moving around. So you want to smooth out the camera as much as possible. So essentially there was a zoom in, zoom out, which allowed the camera to decide based on height and distance, how far to zoom out. And then to use the term hysteresis threshold, that basically all that means is that I don't want the camera to move unless I need to move. So I want to essentially add inertia so that the camera tries not to move unless I have to. I think this is good to do even if you don't have some sort of arbitrary shared screen mode. It basically means that I don't want like the camera jerking around every single time they move it. It's going to wait until they're about out of some range, and then it will go ahead and adjust, and then it will try to prefer not moving until then. And that was all fine. I think the camera turned out pretty well. You just make some hard limits eventually on camera bounds to enforce maximum minimum distance between players. So like you're like, I don't want the characters to be this small. They can't go farther. You have some sort of invisible tether on them where they just quite literally their character stops moving if they're too far away. The harder part is actually level design for this. So I think the technical parts in this case were actually the easier part. The level design is where it actually got more challenging. Because in early playtests, and you can see that it was largely a white box world. These were not like polished assets, but you can start playtesting. You can and you should start playtesting as soon as possible. And you don't have to like hire playtesters. You can just go get your friends to play it. And even if your friends are being nice to you, you can still tell how the game is based on sort of their reactions that are not even necessarily them saying it, because like they might say, oh yeah, I love it, but like you can tell if they're really loving it when they're sort of playing it. How are they playing it? Are they enjoying it, etc. So I found that the shared screen worked really well for the platforming and combat. That actually worked quite nicely. The platforming tended to be a lot of writing, so the mount functionality. But the problem with the puzzle space, it was way too constrained. I was designing my idea of puzzles was very environmentally driven puzzles. So like if you're familiar with like Team Ico games, is like direct inspiration, Ico, Last Guardian, Shadow Colossus is like boss fight puzzle, so that doesn't really count. But like they're big worlds, like so you go between rooms and you change the state of one room, and that changes the state of another room, and then you like sort of build up this idea of what's going on to overcome the puzzle. And that was kind of like what I wanted to do, but it turned out to be impossible with the camera because like they just couldn't move far enough apart. So it was like, okay, we'll both wander over here. So it's like, okay, well, we both have to solve this puzzle. We have to decide to go to this room versus this room. So the exploration of it was not quite working because who plays puzzles actually? Who plays puzzle genre, sort of environmental? A little bit. It turns out you spend a lot of time sort of looking at the space, and you don't want to be bothered with another person when you're exploring that space. You kind of want to just be able to wander around and understand it at your own pace. And even in the local co-op, that wasn't really happening because like one person figures it out and then they're kind of telling the other person what to do. And that's not quite the experience I wanted. The more successful puzzles were really simple puzzles like from Little Big Planet, which is like, it's a room, you look at the room, you both are like, okay, I'll run here, you do it, and it works. So the puzzles I sort of imagined doing were not the ones that were successful, and the puzzles that were like, I'm like, it's not like super interesting. Little Big Planet's great, by the way, I love it, but you're not going to make a whole game of just the co-op puzzles and that. Yeah, and then it turns out you need a balance. When you're thinking about puzzle design, you want to have sort of an idea of how long you expect players to take. So you're like, is this a 1 minute puzzle, a 5 minute puzzle, a 10-minute puzzle, half an hour puzzle? Because you don't actually want players spending half an hour on every puzzle. That's like super annoying. And so the question is, are both players actually solving the puzzle in roughly the same time? And even if they're solving it in the same time, in the sense of 1 minute versus 5 minute, well, if one person's solving it in 1 minute and one person's solving it in 2 minutes, that's still like twice the time. That's a huge disparity, and that's not going to work in a lot of ways. And that problem really would going to be exacerbated once I started looking at simple network tests. So my vision, because I love Journey, is essentially a Journey style matchmaker. So the way Journey works is it's a 1 hour game. You can play it entirely solo, but there is a ability for players to join and drop based on proximity. So essentially, if two players happen to be playing in the same zone, they will be match made to each other seamlessly, and they'll just appear in each other's session, which is like super cool. It's probably one of the most interesting novel mechanics I've seen in any game. And the fluidity of the joining and leaving is like definitely part of the play experience. So you get play experiences where you meet a bunch of players, and you get play experiences where you meet like one player and you do the whole thing with just one person. So every play is very unique, very short game loop. And that all works. And you don't really, but here's the deal. You don't have to play with anyone else. It is fundamentally a single player game. You can do like this trick where you give each other energy so you can fly farther, but like you don't get anything for that. You kind of just get the fun of playing with another player. The puzzles are very simple. And again, they're very expansive, which I think works well, but that means you don't have to be near another player. And again, the total playtime is around an hour. So you can finish the whole game in one session, and that's like just, you just basically start to finish it. And that was where basically I was like, okay, this is not going to work. My design was as a true puzzle platformer rather than an experiential game. And Journey is fundamentally an experiential game, not a puzzle platformer. The other thing I realized, which I had never really thought too hard about, was I sort of just assumed a level of puzzle platforming and skill, puzzle solving and platforming ability that was like not true. So there was like really awkward moments where like some person is just trying to jump and they can't make it, and the other person's like zipping around, and you're just like, okay, this is pretty horrible. So like I would be like, okay, this level is going to take about 15 minutes. This is a good pick up and play length. You just play one zone, one level, and then you're done. You can worry about matchmaking next time. But I wanted these like sequence of puzzles to be 6 hours total. So like I had a bunch of puzzles planned for a bunch of different zones. We'll not worry about that. We'll talk about that later. The actual immediate problem was the skill disparity. Where it's like, no, this isn't going to take 15 minutes. This is going to take much longer because someone's stuck. Someone doesn't know how to figure out how to solve their part of the puzzle. And because it is an asymmetric design, the other player can't like necessarily even reach the place they are. So it's not like you can go over and say, oh, here's how you do it. You can't show that because your character can't get to where the other character is. I don't actually think trolling would have been a problem long term because it's not really designed for that, in part because there's no chat functionality. But it just wasn't working because essentially I just watch as like players finish and then they just sort of wait around, and that's not good either. Chat functionality nominally would help with that, but now you have the troll feature, right? So like I actually don't think you can have chat in this kind of game in any reasonable way. And again, you just can't like guide them, right? You can't navigate for them. You can't assist them. So in a sense, I think the puzzles I was designing were not the puzzles that work well in this cooperative format. And again, I don't think it was like stressful. Everyone was like, yeah, that's pretty okay, which is good. No, I mean, I'm not expecting people in the first play session to be like, this is the best game ever made. That never happens. But you know, so it was like they were fine, but I definitely felt like there was like this sense of, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'm keeping the other player late waiting, you know, like, and that's not how they should be feeling either, right? So it's not like an overwhelming pressure to finish, but if that's sort of your initial pressure in this low stakes environment of like one level, that's really not going to be a good play session over a much longer game. So essentially, I just was like, okay, I need to take a break from this, and I want to rethink the idea entirely of what co-op will look like in this kind of situation. So first of all, what does this mean? So when you get feedback from playtesters, you essentially have to figure out what are they saying and what's working and what's not working. So my original puzzle concepts were like, okay, like people are like, yeah, that's kind of good. And I'm like, that's fine. Like, I'm not expecting to, as I said, I'm not expecting to wow anybody. You kind of assume, one, with more polished art assets, people will be more engaged. And two, you have lots of time to refine your levels, make the puzzles more interesting. That's a thing that is what I call an iterative problem. My concern was I didn't think I could iterate on the core experience of an online version that's not just me and my friend matchmaking directly, like i.e. essentially the same thing as local but remote. So I was like, I don't think this is going to be that kind of experiential game, but with more complexity, which is sort of on some level what I sort of wanted, like Journey with more complex puzzles. I sort of came to the conclusion Journey's role is to not have complex puzzles, that it works best in that world. And because I'm a hobbyist developer, I can essentially be picky about personal projects. So like I don't have to ship a title. So like to be perfectly clear, if someone was paying me, if I had a publisher, I would do whatever it took to essentially get it out the door. And this is something that I think you should be thinking about. Like if you work for a company, they'll tell you what your ticket timeline is. If you work as an indie developer, but you're paying the bills with it, you will have to ship titles you're not necessarily 100% happy with. You just need to get them out the door. And if you're a hobbyist, you won't have as much time to work on things, but then you can be like, okay, I want it to be exactly what I want it to be. So yeah, if I had been funded, I would have just switched to local plus invitation online co-op, and I would have been like, okay, it's like an okay puzzle platformer. Maybe it's kind of fun because you play with a friend. But like I was sort of like, there was other things that I'm not going to get into. Gameplay loop, there was some, I was like, it's a little too plain because puzzle platformers have essentially one solution outside of speedrunning, and speedrunning is definitely not a cooperative kind of market. And I didn't think the narrative was being explored in the way that I wanted it to. So my narrative setup was not like, I think, delivering on what I really wanted to do. I was like, I actually just like dialogue. I'm not really great at doing really involved environmental narrative. So yeah, so Skazka essentially went on hiatus. This is a little storyboard that was like the meeting cutscene, so you can watch it. So this would play. This would essentially play when you first meet the wolf. Cutscenes were required to. You could not skip cutscenes for obvious reasons in remote play. Local play, you could both agree to it. You can both confirm it. Yeah, so got a little cutscene, but I wanted more narrative, more focus on the characters. And yes, so that's basically what I started to think about, which is, okay, I don't think this direction is working. What does the new direction look like? So the first thing is tools had changed in the time that it took me to sort of get to this point. We are now on Unreal 5, which is amazing and has so many features that like things that I was building out sort of by hand are now just things that you get for free. Like all the Procgen stuff is stuff like you would have to make your own tool to do that. Now it's just like, now you just hook it in and you get procedural generation. And so that was essentially going to be one of the big things about like, okay, actually, I think I do want to move away from puzzle platformer. I picked that genre because it's accessible, and I'm like, I think other genres are more accessible now. I'm only building it for local now. So essentially, mission design, I think, will work for online play, but I'm like, okay, I don't think this matchmaking networking is going to work for what I want. So if you play with a friend online, it'll just be a friend you send an invite code to. So that's going to be essentially the idea is local. And I'm like, okay, I think we're at the point where open world is now accessible to indie. So mission focused open world. So a little bit more combat. Combat's pretty fun with co-op. It turns out a little bit easier to design around, I think, than puzzles. Mission focused means you can essentially play solo by yourself in sort of the hub. And then when you get to dungeons and zones, you can call in a friend. So it still has the ethos of I want it to be fully co-op, but now there's an ability to kind of mess around as you're waiting for your friend. Yeah, so simpler puzzles. I think the running around the platforming was pretty fun. So like I think that's great for world exploration. That's still entertaining. More team ups that are combat focused. Again, I love FF15 that has like really cool team up combat kind of stuff. I think that kind of stuff adds a lot to the experience. And now there's like more story segments, narrative segments scattered throughout the world. That's going to be more the goal. That also makes it a little bit more open-ended how you play it. It's a little less linear. Puzzle platformers are very naturally very linear. And I think the modern approach to playing is much more, I want to like self-express. I don't want to like dismiss it, but like that's like people are like, I want to play in the way I want to play. And like for good or for ill, that's kind of what people want. And I think open world suits that better. Also, I was just like, okay, I like making houses. Again, Procgen being what it is, suddenly base management is on the table. I love that kind of stuff. So not like base management in like a stats way, but like base management is you have a house and you can decorate it. Base management. And that, again, Procgen has made that like a thing that like we can all have in any game now, which is pretty cool. Also something to do. Okay, so what does this look like? Well, I played Sakuna of Rice and Ruin a few years ago, and I loved it. It's flawed in certain ways. The combat's like a little janky, but it's like such a cool idea. It's actually a rice farming simulator, which I'm not going to do because I do not know enough about rice farming to make a simulator. But like there's like combat, you manage a little house at home, you get to carry around cats, make friends with like Kappa and stuff, which is like, who doesn't love that? And the combat's like relatively straightforward. There is payout. You can do payloads where you like build out different character attributes, but it's like pretty simple by that standard. So I was like, okay, this is the new target, and I think I like it. It's like it still has the puzzle platformer aspect, but like much lighter, and the hub world idea I think works well, and so it's not a huge adjustment to kind of move more in this direction rather than like Mega Man direction. I haven't even played Visions of Mana, but I put this here because I was so annoyed that they took out co-op. Like, so for anyone who's played the old Secret of Mana games, the coolest thing is that they're action RPGs that you play with friends. You can even see, like, look, they're holding hands. They're clearly friends. But for some reason, it's not a co-op game, and I'm like, why? Like, just let people play with their friends. Like, it's not people want to play with their friends. I think they do. I've decided. So I'm like, okay, but yeah, if we're gonna go action RPG, light on the RPG, suddenly that's like there's a whole genre that informs you how to think about that. So let's just come back to tools, right? So like I was like, I'm gonna leave tools, and that's true, but like tools are still really important. The tools now that are just like off the shelf available are on such a different level than they were 10 years ago. It's like really, really exciting to be working in a game engine, I think. Essentially now you can just like as a single person build out huge levels with actually pretty good efficiency, and you don't have to do any optimizations or anything else, which was like completely off the table back in the day. Same thing with animations. Animations used to be very costly and require a really talented artist, and I still think they do. Like to make really good animations, you need a really good animator, but like some of the Unreal built-in tools means like the blending, the IK handling, all that is like something that now even like a more of an amateur animator like myself could start to think about. Whereas like back in the day, you really needed like a really cracked team to make something even remotely good looking. Same thing with lighting systems. I don't know if anyone saw the latest announcement from Unreal, but it's like just throw in lights and don't even bother to optimize. We'll handle it. I'm like, that's pretty cool. So that's like really nice. The shader pipeline is easier to work with than ever before. And they have a lot of systems so that you can extend it. So like I work primarily in Unreal, as maybe is obvious from me talking about Unreal and no other game engine. But like essentially they have a whole level where you can customize tools on top of like their procedural generation system. You can interface with things if you need to at the shader level. And that's really, really nice. So just for fun, just a couple games that I kind of where I was sort of when I dropped Skazka, I was like, okay, I need to work on something that's smaller and more compact. But of course, then I'm like, wait, I then it was like, I need to have some existential dread, but we didn't get quite there with that. So Copy Bar Cafe, this is basically a little drink making game. You can probably tell from the format that I wanted to make it in a mobile space. So this is going to be for mobile, I think. Although I feel like mobile is such a trash fire dip market right now. I'm not even sure, but it is designed for that. Essentially, you just make drinks for copy bars. So it's just like a little drink alchemy game. You discover new recipes, find ingredients, make friendships with copy bars, help them with their copy bar problems. Some of which are actually kind of like dark because I have a fairly dark sensibility. But yeah, so that was kind of a side thing. Good little project to be working on. This is the thing I'm currently working on. Basically, it's Phoenix Wright in space because I was playing Phoenix Wright and I'm like, man, I just love solving contradictory. I like finding contradictions. I don't know. It's just really entertaining. And I guess while I'm up here, I do actually have a short story coming up in an upcoming anthology, which is the background for Skazka. So if you are like, I want to know more about these characters, you too can read about them in this anthology. And similarly, I brought little bookmarks if you want one of essentially this art right here. So help yourself. If not, I won't be offended. But that's all I have. Thank you. Yes, any questions? I covered a lot of stuff. What's up?
So what's your opinion on, like, I guess developers making people, I guess if you want to play it together with another friend, making the friend buy the game instead of,
Yeah, so that's actually part of my annoyance with online co-op. In fact, like that's why I'm like local co-op is a must. I feel like if someone buys a game, I should be able to go over to your house and play it. And not to like date myself, but old Blizzard games used to be you could essentially unlock them at LAN parties. So like if I were at a LAN party with friends, I can't remember how it worked exactly, but essentially I could install like StarCraft or Diablo or any of these games on my computer just during the LAN party. and we could play together. So I feel like I feel like the emphasis on monetization has really hurt a lot of the core ideas of games. Now we could have a whole talk about like it is a problem. Like right now, the industry is that this is a really like not to like be too negative. This is a really hard time to find a job, as you might know, because essentially a bunch of companies have had big layoffs. So like you as new people on the market are now competing with like 15-year veterans who are like, I just need to feed my family. I'll take a junior position. So like I do support companies making money because I want game developers to be employed. But I actually think you can do that and make people like have a good play experience. So yeah, I think we should be trying to not milk people for money. I think we should be making games where like by virtue of you playing with your friend, you're just so excited that you go out and buy the game. I think that's what I would like to see. That's my utopian vision. Yeah. Yeah.
What do you think about like party games? You were talking a lot.
Yeah, so I've made a number of those are like super easy to make. Those are like the fastest thing you can make. I tend to when I was doing more mobile, that would be like stuff that like would be like contract make a party game because like it's like you take 3 months to make a party game. I'm kind of neutral on them myself. Like they wouldn't be necessarily like I think they're fun at parties. I don't go to a lot of parties. I'm actually very introverted. But I think for me, like what I actually enjoy making is like again more narratively driven things. So I think party games are very hard to make narratively driven. But I think they're definitely a lot of fun, and I think they're a great place also to start development because there's a lot of inherent built-in fun to just like making something that is involving a whole group of people. Yeah.
What do you mean by party game?
Oh, I'm thinking of like Jackbox or I assume Mario Party.
Yeah.
Just like large.
Sort of essentially mini game. I would think of them as like
Yeah.
mini game, party game, like anything that's like a bunch of mini games, or social games. Yeah, Jackbox is like social games. Mario Party's mini games. Yeah. If there's another definition, if there's other games like for sure. For reference, like if I'm like playing games with friends, it's at this point it's usually fighting games, and historically like at LAN parties, like basically anything goes. Like it would have like back in the day Unreal Tournament, StarCraft, Diablo, like all of these are fairly social games that are like a little bit larger scale than what I think was party games. Yeah.
Have you heard of Okami?
I love Okami. Yes.
I was wondering because like when I saw the wolf, you were like just made like the brushes.
Yeah, like Wolf. Yeah, like Amaterasu. Yeah, no, Okami is an amazing game. It's like definitely one of my favorites. Yeah. Yeah, that would be an interest. I feel like that could. There's like I didn't talk about this variety of co-op game. There's a whole variety of co-op game which is person who mostly plays and their friendly companion who hangs out with them. So like I think Mario Galaxy even has this where like a person can just like hang out with them. Yeah, it's like a star and there is actually like Child of Light has something like this. There's a couple games that have that. I'm sort of like I don't know that I want to make games like that, but I think that's actually a really interesting idea. And I feel like Okami, you could like just have the person play as the little flea. Like, I mean, you could like what does it do? Does it change anything in the game? No, but like it's kind of fun to have like a little sibling or whatever, just like shaking the controller around as they move around or something like that. So I think that's like another co-op genre that I didn't really get into. Yeah, there's a much broader space than what I talked about here for sure. Yeah, is that it? All right. Well, thank you for having me. I hope it was entertaining.
There's a there's a Vulcan motor called Hulk. So it's like, wait a second. I've heard that before.
That might be Volk VU.
I think it's. I was looking it
Is it
up.
actually Volk?
No, that's something else. I was just looking at this. The person is kind of cracked.
Oh, they're RC. They actually might be Volk because they're Russian.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This
Okay.
person's cracked.
I mean, they're Russian programmer. Right?
I read their blog. Oh my goodness, they're so cracked. Thank you for coming.
Okay. How's it going?
I am trying to stop the stream.
Yeah.
Oh,
Well,